Build-a-syllabus workshop. Thank you. And so we are recording. So just to make sure everyone knows where they are, you are in a workshop. We're saying for novices, but this is really for anybody who hasn't seen this yet. This is a really valuable workshop. And if you haven't seen it before, you are welcome here. And right after this at noon Eastern time will be our lunch break for 1 hour. All right. So thank you, as always, to our sponsor, to College Bridge, who's making this and especially the webinar format possible for us. So we are in the Build-a-Syllabus workshop, and our speakers today are going to be Emily Sealy-Turner from the University of La Verne, Justin Dunmeyer from Frostburg State, and Tom Mahoney and Chad Wiley, who are both from Emporia State University. And I want to give you a little bit of background on this because this workshop is based on a paper that the four of these wrote together, which was in something you might have heard referred to a few times, the Primus Special Issue on Mastery Grading. And this was a special issue, right, of an education-focused, sort of scholarship of teaching and learning focused journal in mathematics. And I was one of the organizers of that special issue. And what happened when we put out the call for papers is we got 2 papers, both of which put together a really well thought out, nicely done structure for how people new to mastery grading should build a syllabus, right? How do you build your first course from not knowing anything about mastery grading up through being a full-on use of it? 2 papers, and both of them were great. And so all of the guest editors looked at each other and we said, well, this is wonderful and we need both of these, but we can't actually have both of these in the journal. And so what do? Well, we get a hold of these 4 people who were together the authors of those 2 papers and say, so how do you all feel like smashing your papers together into one even better paper? Which of course, if you are the authors, it's not really what you want to hear. The prize for doing great work, of course, is more work. And that's what we asked these 4 to do. But the result is also a fantastic result that combines the strengths of all of their individual ideas. So before we get going, I want to point out that at the very bottom right here, there is a link, a bit.ly link for resources that go with this talk. And you may want to go there right now. And with that, I am going to turn everything over to Emily, Justin, Tom, and Chad.
Thank you very much. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So like I said, this workshop is based heavily on this paper that we wrote and is available until the end of June, along with other great mastery grading papers. So the workshop is broken into 4 big questions that we address in that paper and with sub-questions. And the structure that we've settled on is that we'll introduce the question and then each of us will take a turn answering it from our perspective. And then we'll move on to the next question. And we encourage you to use the Q&A feature because while only one of us can talk at a time, the other 3 are sort of chipping away at those Q&A questions, elevating them to live questions, or just answering them as best we can. So we can kind of get some answers straight away, hopefully in the moment for you. And then we're also gonna talk about some pitfalls, and we're gonna have a more broad Q&A session at the end. So Emily, do you want to take us away with our first question?
Sure. Or did we want to introduce ourselves first?
Oh yeah, I'm Justin from Western Maryland, used to be in Michigan, Frostburg State University.
I'm Emily. I'm University of La Verne here in Southern California.
Tom Mahoney, Emporia State University in Kansas.
Chad Wiley, also from Emporia State, like just across the hall from Tom.
So, yeah, next slide now. Okay, so the first big question we thought about when we were writing the paper, and you would have to think about if you were implementing mastery grading, is what learning objectives will I measure? So, these have lots of different names, standards or specs, or, learning objectives. Sometimes I just call them that. But they could take different forms depending on what you want to measure. So sometimes these might be skill-based objectives. And we'll show some examples of stuff that we use in our own classes here in a second. But these would be things like, just certain skills that students have to learn. You could also have broad or process-based objectives. I know yesterday, when I was in some of the sessions, this came up. If you want to measure more than just skills, you can also measure things like, can students determine if their answer makes sense? Or things like that. So they could be more process-based. And then, what other requirements do you have? So you might have a project that students have to do, or a paper, or other things that you want to measure. And those will eventually become part of your mastery grading scheme. So we're going to just go through some examples of what we do in our own classes. So we'll do next slide.
All right, so Chad and I frequently get together each semester to brainstorm how to design our courses to incorporate mastery grading. Over the years, this means that for a particular course, we have basically converged on the same syllabus for that course. So to save you from hearing the same things twice, we'll each talk about a different kind of course. Just know that each of the ideas that I talk about is something that Chad also does, and vice versa. In answering these 4 questions, I'll be focusing on how Chad and I structure skill-based courses like calculus or college algebra, where the goal is for students to build proficiency with course-specific content needed for usually other courses. I chose a standards-based flavor of mastery grading for these courses because I want students to demonstrate that they have mastered skills in a particular subject area, because these skills will be required in those future courses. Chad will be answering these questions from the perspective of how we approach our proof-based courses, such as abstract algebra, real analysis, or intro proofwriting courses, where the goal is more about building overall fluency with the subject, and in particular, writing about that subject. And it's more about that than it is about mastering any particular skill within that subject. Some courses we teach, such as linear algebra, involve a blend of ideas from both skill-based and proof-based courses. In answering this first question about choosing learning objectives for skill-based courses, I define my objectives based on what I cover from each section of the textbook. Usually I end up with about 1 objective per section, which for a 5 credit hour Calculus 1, Calculus 2 course is about 25 objectives. When I was starting out with mastery grading, this setup made the transition much easier because it was conceptually similar to the objectives I would have measured in a traditionally graded course. Some objectives I use for calculus and college algebra include using the fundamental theorem to evaluate integrals, applying horizontal and vertical shifts to functions, or I might group several things, like everything dealing with equations of lines, into a single objective that I measure. Now I'll pass it on to Chad for his thoughts.
All right. So Tom mentioned that we do very similar things. So he's going to be focusing on skill-based courses. I'm going to be focusing on our proof-based courses. Now, I know especially this year, we have people attending who are not math faculty, a lot more of them. So what I'm talking about here are more advanced courses that aren't focused on, like specific skills that you need to do, like, apply the chain rule in a calculus class. The classes that we're thinking of here tend to involve a lot of writing and a lot of mathematical reasoning. It's a lot more of like, why does this work sort of questions. So they're very different, and a different approach tends to work better. For these kinds of courses, I use something that's closer to like specs grading that Linda Nilsson was talking about yesterday than standards-based grading. My content objectives tend to be pretty broad. So I've got an example here from a topology class. Example might be students will be able to identify topologies and topological spaces. That is something that covers a lot of ground. It's not like just a particular skill that I want to see if students can do. It's like a sort of a broad collection of skills. But in addition to content, I will typically also include objectives focused on writing, because one of the specific goals for this kind of a course is I want to encourage students to be better mathematical communicators. Also, just because of the particular format of a lot of these courses, ESU has an online graduate math program. We've had it for years. Even pre-pandemic, we were teaching a lot of online courses. These are typically asynchronous, and we have students that are kind of scattered all over the country. And so I have a sort of unofficial objective that's focused on building class community. So I'll often have students like participate in discussion threads that are there to get them to build connections with other students or to connect course material to broader ideas in like a non-homework format. So you can add kind of, special objectives that are specific to what you want to do with the class. All right, I think Justin's going to be up next.
Justin, this
Yep,
must
you're
happen
muted.
in every meeting. You're unmuted. There you go.
Yes, got it. Thank you. So I'm going to focus, I'm a mathematician, so I'm going to focus on my sort of lower division classes like calculus, differential equations, linear algebra. But this is my go-to when I think about choosing learning objectives. I tend to go broad. So you can see these 11 objectives cover my entire calculus course. And they give me a way in to see if students can interpret these important concepts or do these important approximations, those calculations, through a variety of different question styles. So I really like these broad objectives for specific skills, which is of course important to me. I tend to use gateway style exams for those. So you can see at the bottom of that list that I can calculate derivatives with at least 75% accuracy. So that translates to like a computerized exam that they can take twice a day, and they have to get at least 75% of those right to claim the pass on that. The other thing is, though, that some of these other requirements that you'll see in a lot of syllabi, like communication, attention to details, these are really important to me. But rather than set them as a separate standard to be checked off, I incorporate those into a multi-tier grading system that we'll talk about in a bit later. So for my other, like my upper division courses, I use something much more specs-based, and pretty much you can just copy and paste what Chad says onto my classes, and you'll be good to go. So I'm gonna pass it off to Emily next.
All right. So yeah, I kind of sometimes use a mix of what's been talked about. I definitely do topic-based standards, so more skills-based standards. But when I teach a proof-based course, specifically in Intro to Proof, I have an example here. I use what are called concept check standards and proof writing standards. I just to give credit where credit's due, I wholesale stole that from Rachel Weir. So, the proof writing standards are, they have to actually, construct a valid proof. The concept check standards are more like, they have to use a definition and be able to apply that. So those are different type of standards. And I noticed someone in the Q&A talked about, would these proof-based objectives be helpful for lower levels? So that's possible. Also, with proofs, I grade them on both correctness and style. So, if there's a lot of unnecessary things, then, they may get a revise. Or if there's a lot of, just extra stuff in there. So they know that when they write their proofs. I also usually use some combination of projects, learning community, which I stole from Justin, which is basically, what they actually do in the classroom. Participation, and then sometimes portfolio or application problems. So these are more in-depth problems that they have to do and turn in. And, as we'll talk about in a little bit, they have to turn in a certain amount for a C and then more for a B and for an A. All right, so next slide. This is Tom.
Our next big question is, how are you going to define and measure mastery? Because once you decide what objectives you want students to master, you have to decide what you mean by the word mastery, as well as how you plan to measure that mastery. This includes decisions about whether to use quizzes or exams or projects or homework sets to assess mastery. Maybe you just want a binary pass-revise system, or maybe you want a more refined system with multiple levels of mastery, like EMRN. Is demonstrating mastery of an objective something students only need to do once, or should students demonstrate repeated mastery for retention? Of course, it's not enough to just measure mastery. It's absolutely vital that students know where they stand. So you need to think about how you will communicate students' course progress with respect to measuring these objectives and mastering them. Chad?
Sorry, happened again. In my upper division courses, I will measure mastery of both the content and writing skill objectives kind of at the same time. And that's by looking at student homework proofs. This is pretty typical for these kinds of classes. Students spend most of their time writing arguments. And I will grade these as just on a 2-tier system. They either pass or I'll mark them as revise, and students will have to go back and fix them and turn them in again. The criteria that I use are really based on 2 things. Do I think that the argument is logically correct? Does it follow the way that standard mathematical arguments do? And is the writing really clear? I usually try to tell students that they should imagine they're writing for their peers, right? Someone else in the class who hasn't attempted this particular problem yet. You're kind of trying to walk them through the argument for it. And both of these need to be acceptable in order to earn a pass. I'm not going for perfection necessarily, but I do want to aim at a pretty high bar. This is a way to encourage good writing habits. In any sort of mastery grading system, revisions are going to be pretty critical. That's one of the pillars that was mentioned at the opening session there. We're grading eventual mastery, not immediate mastery, which this is an idea that I stole at some point from Robert Talbert. This is really good in terms of mathematical proofs, especially because it's much more like what professional mathematics is like. And I imagine this translates pretty well to other disciplines as well, because if you're writing an academic paper, you don't just submit it once and it gets graded and sent back to you. You engage in a sort of back and forth with reviewers and editors about like what was good and what needs to be fixed up, and you eventually sort of land on a product that everyone is happy with. And it's nice to have that kind of experience put into the classroom directly. Let's see. So that's what I try to do. I try to put feedback on any proof that gets revised so students know what I'm expecting of them on the next attempt. And sometimes I'll even put feedback on proofs that pass as well. They'll sometimes have small issues that I don't think are worth a revision, but I still want to give that feedback to them. I typically don't give exams. That's sort of for philosophical reasons. I'm kind of the weirdo in the math department for classes like this. But I will often include like a presentation or a portfolio to kind of gauge student overall understanding. And in terms of communicating scores back to students, that can be a little difficult because we use Canvas, and Canvas really loves percentages. It's aimed at a traditional grading system. So I kind of have to jury rig it. I know there is a mastery grading gradebook in Canvas that I will learn to use one day, but it's not today. All right, so I think Justin is up next.
Aha, no one had to tell me this time. So I primarily use quizzes as my way of defining and measuring mastery. These used to be in-class quizzes, but on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how that's changed. The number depends on the objective and the course. So for something that I consider to be essential to my course, so if I focus on calculus, interpreting the derivative, I think is very, very important to me. That might show up on 7 different quizzes throughout the semester. Other topics and other classes, maybe it's different. So for instance, in some of my other classes, every topic, every objective appears on exactly 2 quizzes. And then based on how many quizzes there are, that determines how many passes I require to have a mastered objective, right? So maybe it's 1, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3. I've done lots of different things with that. I want to say a bit about final exams. My first foray into mastery grading, I threw out the final, or I had it as like a last chance on all the different objectives. And I've really come to appreciate a cumulative final as an opportunity for final synthesis. So I've built it back in and I've made it points-based. And it acts as a grade modifier in my class. So based on their mastery of learning objectives, students have a pre-final grade of A through F. And then if they score higher than 90% on the final, they move up one letter grade. And if they score below a threshold, they move down, right? So if you have an A going into the final and you take away less than 70% on the final, I think maybe that A wasn't so strong. Maybe it's more like a B. And I found that I really like that. Students really appreciate the chance to have that last chance to score that 90 and move from a B to an A. Not too many students move down. And so I'm quite happy with it. And the students appreciate having the kind of the pressure off on the final. They study a little bit, but they don't go overboard. As far as the quizzes themselves, I grade on a 3-tier system, something, it needs revising, it's a pass or a pass plus. So typically my quiz will be like 2 questions or 2 sections of questions. One I call the basic questions. And those are the things that I expect. If a student's going to walk away from my course with a C, they need to be able to do these kinds of things. And so if you get those basic questions right, then you get a pass. Up to arithmetic mistakes and other silly kinds of things. And then there's another section of reach questions, which are more conceptual, difficult questions, extension questions, things that they haven't seen before. And those passing those gets you the pass plus. And then, as I mentioned before, things like attention to detail, clarity of thought, clarity of writing, those things also factor into a pass plus. So something that technically answers all the questions, but is really all over the place, really dropped a lot of symbolism, other things that are important to the details of the course, that's going to get a pass, not a pass plus. In terms of communication, I can't stress enough how important it is and how it's my greatest weakness. I found through the pandemic how having all the grades in the LMS, the students really appreciated it, but you also have to be very clear with where they're standing because LMSs want to do silly things with how they're presenting grades. I have a colleague who has a great Canvas hack where he changed the overall course grading system so that no matter what percentage it says C syllabus for your grade, so that they have a reminder that, oh yeah, it's that percentage isn't quite right. And if we can go to the next slide, I want to talk about COVID-19 or how I learned to stop worrying and love the take-home quiz. So obviously in the pandemic scenario, I had to make my quizzes take home, and I was very resistant to that at first, I gotta say. And then it wasn't so bad. And then I tried it again in the fall and in the spring, and I've got something that I'm really happy with. So I thought I'd share it now. So everything is a take-home quiz that opens up a ton of class time for me. Part 0 is an honor code. They have to check off what is and isn't allowed. Part 1 is a timer starts in the LMS, and then they have to upload their answers in 20 minutes. And then part 2 is the untimed version. So they take the same quiz, but there's no time restriction, and they have access to their notes, and that's due the same day. Theoretically, it's due before I give them feedback on the timed quiz, but generally it's the same day. The timed version is graded on 4 scales. So not yet, repairable, pass or pass plus. So a repairable is you are really close to a pass, but there's something that's just, you're just not quite there. And then the untimed quiz was graded on whether it improves the grade or does not improve the grade. And then a not yet becomes a successful revision. Repairable becomes a pass, pass becomes a pass plus remains pass plus. And what this meant to me was, one, I was really worried that I was going to be double grading, but I couldn't let go of the idea, so I just did it. And I didn't end up double grading. That was a relief. In fact, it made the grading a lot more enjoyable because I got to watch my students catching the mistakes that they were making on the timed version without my feedback. And I found that to be very meaningful and worthy of improving their grade and something to celebrate. And the other thing to this is I did audio feedback on these quizzes through the LMS. It took a little bit longer to record a short message, but it allowed me to give a lot more feedback than I could reasonably write. It allowed me to convey tone, like, hey, this went sideways on you, but I'm glad to see that, you recovered it in the untimed version, etc. So why not make them all untimed? And I think I find it pretty valuable that there's some sort of fluency conveyed with the ability to do something in 20 minutes, right? You can always get this pass plus, this highest possible score in the untimed version, as long as you can show me that you were fluent enough in the timed version that you could keep up with class, right? That you could engage in a meaningful conversation with your peers. So I want to pass it over to Emily, and we can talk more about this at the end.
Yeah, so I've adopted a couple things that Justin does. For instance, sometimes I use that sort of grade modifier final that he mentioned. But what I normally do and how I measure mastery is really dependent on the course. So I had quiz sessions, and students are available or able to complete several quizzes during those sessions. So the quizzes are fairly short because they're just on one standard. I've also, just like Justin, had to kind of change that over due to online teaching. And so I've been able to utilize my math lab, as well as I've just made like Qualtrics surveys to give students a amount of time in which they can take the quizzes. So usually it's a couple days. So that's our quiz session. And then they can access the quizzes sort of anytime within that time. And if I use my Qualtrics survey, I know exactly when they access the quiz, and then they have a certain amount of time to get it uploaded to me. So I have found that timed quizzes are sort of the way to go there, just because, it minimizes cheating a little bit, but also, it kind of helps me control who's doing what at what time. So that's sort of how I've modified this for our online environment. Sometimes in proof-based courses, I have some standards that have to be passed on homework and on a quiz. So, for instance, if the standard is, write a proof using induction, I want to see that they can actually write several proofs using induction, because there's different types of problems that will come up. So I want them to sort of pass it in more than one way. Again, some courses have a final that's usually this grade modifier final. And some courses don't. Sometimes I just use that finals week for more revisions or reattempts. So for instance, I just taught real analysis, and we sort of had a final, but it was really just to kind of give them more attempts to pass certain standards. And we use Blackboard at my university. We might be changing to Canvas, so unfortunately I might have to relearn how to do this in Canvas, but right now the thing I like about Blackboard is you can input a grade as text, so you can write their grade as pass. There are it's a little bit different now that we've updated to Blackboard Ultra. But in terms of using it for master grading, I found that it actually works okay. Of course, I recommend that students always sort of keep track of the grades themselves using the syllabus. And then I usually send quarterly grade updates. Sometimes it gets a little bit more frequent as we get towards the end of the semester. But just so I know that they know, where they're at, what they need to do. And usually my students say that that's pretty helpful. So Tom.
All right. So I almost exclusively use a binary pass reattempt system, primarily with quizzes covering a single objective. A pass is reserved for work that is perfect, except maybe for an insignificant error. But for such a restrictive system, there can feel like a lot of edge cases, especially when trying to determine which errors are significant and which ones are insignificant. For any non-obvious case, I ask myself, will the student benefit from trying this again? I'll say that again. Will the student benefit from trying this again? I first heard this idea from Chad, who first heard it from Austin Moore, and I continue to repeat it because I find it an immensely helpful reminder about what the purpose of mastery grading is. Student learning is, after all, the end goal, so this question helps me to focus on that goal. Students may earn up to 2 passes on each objective, and exams are an opportunity to earn a pass on each standard that's been covered so far. Next slide, please. I keep track of student progress using pivot tables, and it has been superior to everything that I've tried before that. The learning curve can be a bit steep, but the idea is to use a spreadsheet to keep a ledger of every single attempt, every single event. For example, Chad Wiley took a quiz on June 2nd in office hours over a derivatives objective and earned a pass, and it was version 2 of that quiz. Each column represents something that you want to track: a name, a date, objective, the result, the version, maybe the location, whether it's office hours, a makeup, or an in-class attempt. Then you can use pivot tables, which are in Excel or in Google Sheets, to turn this information into a more traditional looking gradebook, as in the middle table. Then I use the pivot table to create a progress report in Word that I send to students using mail merge each and every week. Pivot tables do have a learning curve, but I created a video tutorial playlist on YouTube to help you get started, and any feedback or requests for more tutorials are welcome. Now we go on to question 3.
All right. Make sure I'm not muted. I'm not. Okay. Okay, so the third question is about translating all this, the students' progress, into a grade. If you think about your class from the student's point of view, this is going to be probably the biggest question they have. How do I get a grade in this class, right? Students they've been conditioned over years of, the US education system that, grades are the central thing. So this is something that you want to think hard about, right? Spend a fair amount of time considering how you want to do it. And I think the most natural starting point is this question: what do I expect from a C student? Like, what do you actually want your students' grade in your course to mean? And like, what do you think is like kind of like that baseline level? And then you can extrapolate to other grades. And this involves some sort of follow-up questions, like, should higher grades require more work, or should they require higher quality work, or both? And there's various ways to answer these questions, and you find one that works best for you. Then you need to decide on what's the best method to track whether students have met these requirements. And there's a lot of ways to do this as well. You can go with traditional weighted averages. That might be something you could do in a course that has a sort of minimal mastery implementation. Some parts are graded for mastery and some parts are graded more traditionally. Or you could go to the popular bundles option, where requirements for each grade are explicitly laid out. You need to consider whether you want to use plus or minus grading. And if you do, or if you're required to, you have to decide how to fit that into your system. And depending on the system you put together, you're probably also going to want to spend some time thinking ahead and try to anticipate any twists or surprises that might be lurking for students, to try to smooth those out early on, rather than having to do it on the fly. All right, so we will jump in with Justin.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry. This is a problem I had yesterday, and I'm going to have to take a moment to.
There we go.
Are we here? Thank you.
So, okay, there's a lot here, and I want to start in the middle. So this is a table from my syllabus that lays out how my grade bundles are organized. So the way to read it is each column represents the minimum requirements to earn that grade. And so that means that, let's look at the A student, for instance. They have to have their core competency complete, or core mastery. I'll talk about that in a moment. The sum of their percentages of pass, pass plus, and successful revisions needs to be at least 90%. There was a question in the Q&A about why should a student go for a pass, for a pass plus. And that's because it's the main, you can see from this chart, it's the main determiner for me between an A, B, and a C. In fact, most of my, seems like a lot of my grades are solely determined by that category. But they need at least 80% of their quizzes to be a pass plus. They need 90% of their learning community points. So those are things like doing readings or attending class, being ready to participate in the learning community. They need 90% of their homework checks. And just to quickly come back to what's the difference between a pass and a pass plus. A pass is a correct answer on the basic questions of a quiz. And a pass plus is a correct answer on both the basic questions and the reach questions of the quiz. Pass plus also incorporates things like attention to detail, clarity of writing, and those other kinds of fuzzier things. And so the homework is a place where I capture a lot of things that maybe don't quite fit into one of my learning objectives. So for instance, I don't have a learning, if you're familiar with calculus, you may be surprised, oh, he doesn't have a learning objective on limits, right? We do a lot of limits work in calculus. Well, that'll appear in a homework. I just didn't want it to appear on a quiz after quiz after quiz. So to check on homework, each homework assignment is 4 checks, is one concept, 4 different checks. The first check for attempting it, second check for being able to look at the whole homework and say, do I think you have the concept, yes or no? And then if you have those 2 checks, then you can also get a check for attention to detail and a check for your overall presentation. The first draft for the homework is due in really quick, the next class, if possible. And then after the feedback, you have 2 weeks to submit a final draft. If you're happy with your first draft, you can keep it, you don't have to resubmit it. And then you can also see, so they need 90% of their homework and 90% of the calculation. So that's the specific for this course. And then a brief word on core mastery here. So that's the subset of targets that I believe you need to have to earn a C in the class. So, perhaps I care that you have to be able to do both interpreting the derivative and interpreting the integral, but I don't care which of the 3 approximating ideas you can do, or which 2 of the 4 utilizing that you can do. Maybe you're great at these related rates problems and constrained optimization, or you're great at finding mins and maxes and related rates. I don't care which of the 2, but you just have to have 2 of them. So this is my way of saying, well, you don't have to hit all of these to pass the class, but you have to hit this important subset. And so looking over to clarify on the homework, yes, they do not have to directly link to these learning objectives. It's a way for me to get some other stuff that's important, but maybe doesn't quite fit into this. So yes, so and theoretically, yes, but these percents are usually, they're rolling, right? So every time you take a quiz, your percentage is going to change. And so the question is about, like, once I make one of these things, do I stop doing that work? That is a model, and I think it's a good one. It's not mine. They're engaging with these quizzes right up to the end because they're keeping on trying to keep whether or not they're keeping that 80% or sliding down. And so I want to pass it off to Emily next.
Yeah. So I've definitely found, I think before the pandemic and before teaching online, I was doing something akin to, what we've talked about, some sort of minimum number of standards passed, plus a learning community percentage, plus a minimum number of other things, and possibly a final exam modifier. But in my experience, a lot of my students, once the pandemic hit, they were working a lot, or they were caring for family members or children or, whatever. They just kind of had a lot going on. So I kind of went looking for a more simple scheme. And as always, this is kind of the point of my talk. I stole again. I stole this time from Robert Talbert. He has a really nice kind of base grade calculation. And then he uses engagement credits to kind of move them up to a plus or a minus, or possibly even move them down. So I've adopted that, and I found that it's really great. The engagement credits are sort of optional. They definitely do need to do a certain amount to keep their base grade. So if they get in the base grade category of a B, it's still possible for them to move down to a C if they don't have any engagement credits. But, I offer a lot of possibilities for them to get engagement credits, and they only actually need, some certain amount. So that means that they can not do some of these engagement credit assignments. And for me, they're usually like online homework. I made good use of the discussion board on Blackboard to kind of get them engaged with each other, even though we weren't on campus. I did things like reflections and things like that. So I offered them a lot of ways to get these credits, but they didn't need to do every single assignment to get those credits. And I found that this worked really well. And for me, it's really simplified my grading scheme. So basically they need to pass a minimum number of standards to fall in a base grade category, as well as I used what I called project problems or application problems. So these are sort of more in-depth problems that are, applying something that we've done in class. And that's really all they needed to do. They needed to just kind of do those two things to fall in a base grade. And then, that was modified with a plus or minus based on how many engagement credits they've had. And I found that for me, at least, this works really well. The place where students get kind of concerned is when, at the beginning, they're like, wait, I forgot to do this assignment. And can you open it back up? And I'm like, oh yeah, no, I can't, but don't worry, like you don't need it. So it's helped me not have to, go back and open up a million assignments because they forgot to do it. I just tell them, grab the next one or the one after that. And I'm making sure to be very clear about how many engagement credits they actually need. And then, if I find that certain students need more at the end, I can just kind of open up more assignments. So for me, this has been really kind of life-changing, because I found that, it's a lot less work from my end. Like, yeah, I have more assignments, but most of them are auto-graded, or they're just like, graded credit, no credit based on, some minimal amount of specs. But it really helps students to kind of do some of these things and then help them keep or modify, into a plus whatever base grade they have. All right, so Tom.
One of the reasons I switched to mastery grading was for simplicity. I don't like agonizing over the number of partial credit points to award, or students asking how many points do I need on the final to pass. So in systems I use, I prioritize simplicity, both with how a particular assignment is graded and how students can determine letter grades. The chart below captures the kind of simplicity that I aim for. The chart accompanies each weekly progress report that I send students so they can see and easily look to see where they are with respect to the chart. If I have 25 skill-based objectives and each can be passed twice for 50 total check marks, I usually build in a few other ways to earn checkmark credits, such as daily homework, labs, attendance, etc. And in the case of the chart below, there is a maximum of 58 possible checkmarks. Using standard 90, 80, 70, 60% cutoffs as a very rough, just as a starting point, I then consider what I really want passing to mean and what it should be, and then I adjust the letter grade thresholds accordingly. Bundles are common, but so far I've mostly avoided them in skill-based courses. I end up agonizing over situations where a student overachieves in one area, but underachieves in another. If a student has mastered every single skill objective, then I believe the student deserves an A, regardless of their progress in, say, online homework. So I tend to use other graded components like homework as a buffer to not require mastery in every single objective twice.
All right. Sorry, I lost my place here. Okay. For my proof classes, I tend to use a bundle system, and this is an example of the grading chart from my topology class from a few years ago. It's sort of broken down by what I want students to do. A lot of the class is based on homework problems, but there's a few other things in there. I had learning objectives that I wanted to keep track of. I had graded discussions for that sort of classroom community effect that I wanted. And one of the things I wanted to point out was the presentation requirement that is only required for students going for higher grades. I believe Linda Nilsson mentioned this yesterday. You can have assessments that are like only for higher level requirements, higher level bundles, and that's perfectly fine. I did see a question in the Q&A asking if I could talk a little bit more about the presentation. The question asked about for intro to proof classes, and I tend actually not to use presentations per se in intro to proof classes, just because those classes tend not to be as content focused. They tend to be more like writing and like procedure focus. It's trying to get students into the specific kind of technical writing that we do in mathematics. I'm more likely to do something like require them to put together a portfolio in a class like that. But in a content focused class like topology, or I'm teaching a knot theory course right now, what I'll typically do is have students either find an application from the textbook if you're using a textbook that has good applications, or like go out and find a research article if it's a graduate course like my topology or my knot theory classes are. Find a research article that's sort of appropriate for the class and kind of explain that to the rest of the students, and that tends to work pretty well. It lets students be kind of creative, and it kind of really shows off that they can learn stuff on their own without me sort of feeding it to them. I should mention that I kept this example from a few years ago in because I think it's a good example of how I would typically put bundles together. But sort of piggybacking off something Tom said, in fact, this is an idea that he had that I stole. I actually changed things up a bit last semester for exactly the reason that Tom was talking about. Things like these graded discussion points for building classroom community, or for an intro to proofwriting class, I might have like LaTeX assignments to get them used to writing things in LaTeX, or I might have like daily practice problems for a class that uses a lot of active learning. And I can have those as separate bundles, but then you do run into the problem of what happens when a student like does really well on the homework, like writes good proofs, but then like didn't do the daily practice. Well, they still showed a lot of mastery, but according to the chart, they might end up with a C instead of an A. And that did bother me a little bit. And so I tried a slightly different system where a lot of these sort of like extra requirements, like daily practice or graded discussions, I would sort of lump them all into a participation grade that would not be a separate bundle exactly. Like the grading chart would still include like homework and presentation and things like that. But I would say that students need to maintain an 80% on their participation assignments, all of them, total over the course of the semester. And if they ended the semester with participation less than 80%, that would impact their grade, like their overall grade would go down. So it became more of a modifier, and I like that system better. I'm still tinkering with it, so I didn't want to include it on this slide until I'm really happy with it, but that's kind of where I'm headed. I try to keep the grading chart fairly simple. And this is something I'll talk about a little bit later, but I want students to feel like they have agency in the grade they get. And in order to do that, they need to know exactly what's required of them. That's what I like about bundles in general. It just lays everything out, in a very straightforward way. I tend not to use plus or minus grading in my classes. That's just a personal preference. One thing I will say is I try to keep the system simple, so there generally aren't a lot of like unforeseen twists that students need to worry about. But I am willing to make adjustments on the fly if necessary in the student's favor. For instance, when the pandemic hit, I had to just sort of change how I had to change a lot of my grading charts for my classes, just because I thought that the requirements I had set up originally weren't fair in the new paradigm we were working in. And so that happens from time to time. I will make adjustments, but I won't spring making something harder on students. If I'm making adjustments, I will generally make it easier. Okay, and I think
Chad,
we'll move on to
before you move
question.
on,
Yes.
can you talk about in your learning objectives row, sometimes it says like pass 1, master 5 versus
Oh
pass
yeah,
4, master
yeah.
2.
Good question. So this is actually this is actually something that I don't really use as much anymore, but mostly because I found it wasn't actually giving me helpful data. For this class, I was worried about having a situation where, like, you know, I had these different content standards. Like, yeah, I mentioned one earlier on, like identifying topological spaces, and one might be, you know, a student needs to be able to prove properties about compact spaces or prove properties about connected spaces, you know, stuff that's pretty specific to the course. And I was worried about, you know, what if a student can, like, should a student be able to get an A in the course without ever having, like, been able to prove something about connected spaces? And so I set up these learning objectives where basically, in order to show me that you've sort of mastered the objective of understanding connected spaces, you have to pass a certain number of problems from that chapter. And so pass was, I think, just pass one problem, and mastered was if you pass more than one problem. What I ended up finding out when I looked over my grading chart at the end was that this wasn't really solving a problem that was actually there. It was solving a potential problem that existed in my mind, but when I looked at what students were passing, this wasn't really an issue. And so I ended up taking it out of later versions of the class. All right. So question 4.
So our last question is about flexibility, and we've seen some in the Q&A and through the chat, right? You know, there's some of these can be rigid requirements, right? What's going to happen if a student makes all of the requirements for an A in a bundle except for one? How are you going to handle that? And are students going to be able to do reassessments? What form will that take? How am I going to not be overloaded in office hours? How often are reassessments allowed? You know, there's a lot of good questions in here, and one that we didn't really talk about here, but has come up before, right? Is the token economy, right? Or engagement credits or other ways. Limited ways for students to break the rules. So we'll lead with Emily. How do you build flexibility into your classes?
Yeah, so I know Linda Nielsen yesterday talked a lot about tokens. And so I've, you know, definitely been making use of tokens to do that. So, you know, lately I have a policy where students can take a quiz twice on a standard. After that, they're welcome to take it again, but they just need to use a token to do so. And that's mainly for my control, especially now that the quizzes are online. I don't really want them to be just taking it over and over and over again and not passing it. You know, usually, in my opinion, once they take it twice and they don't pass it, then there's something that we need to talk about. So that's when they sort of need to tell me, hey, I want to use a token to take it again. And then that sparks a conversation between us, like, oh, okay, can you just talk to me about, you know, why you didn't pass it before, or what, you know, what the problem is. So what I do is I give students a certain amount of tokens to start. I usually give them 3. And they can be used for some other things besides just to, you know, take quizzes more than twice. They can extend certain deadlines and things like that. But I allow them to earn more tokens, usually by interacting with me in some way. So if they come to my office hours, they can get a token. I also had a learning assistant, which was just an undergraduate student that was, you know, coming to the class and holding her own sessions. So if they went to one of her sessions, then they got a token. And, you know, other people build in other ways to provide more tokens. But I felt like that was 3 was enough for most students. And then, you know, if they needed more, then it sparked a conversation between us. So it really, in my opinion, only made things better. I do allow, you know, reassessments. If they're on quizzes, then I don't usually, if the quizzes are online, I haven't been limiting how many they can take per week. They can just sort of take as many as they have time for. Before, when they had to reassess in office hours, I was limiting that to a certain amount per week. When they're turning in revisions that are written, so like on a homework problem, I, again, usually use a maximum there per week so I don't get overloaded, especially towards the end of the semester, right? So when we first went online mid-semester, I said, I'm removing that, just do the revisions when you can get to them. And of course, at the end of the semester, I had like a million things to grade. So I highly recommend you put something like that in place, that you remind students like, hey, you can't let these revisions go until the end of the semester. Or you put some sort of limit on when's the last time they can do them. So I have a colleague who says they can revise proofs up until the next exam or something like that. And then, as I mentioned before, now that I'm using engagement credits, that really adds flexibility in a different way. It makes it so they don't have to complete all of the homework, let's say, right? Or they don't have to do the discussion boards. So, just because I have all these things doesn't mean that they necessarily have to do all of them. So that makes it easier for me to not have to extend deadlines on them. But it also makes it easier for them that, they don't get penalized for not doing some of these things that, while I agree they could help them in passing the quizzes, that they may just not have time for. They do have to do some of them, but they don't have to do all of these assignments, right? So that's the other way that I've been adding flexibility, is by using those engagement credits. Tom.
Each week, for me, students are allowed to reattempt one quiz over any objective. Reattempting work is a core philosophical value in my teaching, and I want to encourage it by making it as easy for students as possible. In some cases, students can earn the ability to take a second quiz. For example, if a student passes the first quiz in office hours, then they can take a second. In our Calc 1 and Calc 2 courses, we have the gateway exams where all objectives relating to derivatives or integrals are assessed together. Students must pass 9 out of 10 of such problems to pass the gateway, which gives them, which they can reattempt weekly. And once students pass a major milestone like a gateway exam, they level up and can take 2 office hour quizzes per week for the rest of the semester. The thought is that before passing the gateway, students should really be making that a priority rather than a second quiz attempt. Reattempts may be taken any time that I'm in my office. I found that formal scheduling created more overhead than was worth it for me, and I have a problem bank and can fairly quickly make new quiz versions on demand. Because I changed all graded components into check marks, students have some flexibility with how they want to improve their grade. Mastering specific core objectives might be required, but students who struggle with the pressure of quizzes can focus on doing the daily homework to earn a couple of extra check marks, or can work on completing lab projects to fill in these holes. Other students might find that it's less time intensive to really focus on studying for a particular objective and just pass that quiz than it is to complete a larger volume of homework or lab projects. Chad?
Flexibility is actually an area where I'm still kind of actively making changes. Revisions are a really central portion of what I do in my proof related classes because, like I said earlier, I want to get that sort of back and forth feeling. I used to allow more or less unlimited revisions on a problem. And that's something that I've kind of recently changed because I had a suspicion that it was leading to some grade inflation. So I've now switched it to each problem can be revised up to 2 times. And this does remove a little bit of flexibility, but it encourages more students to put more thought into each attempt. And the stakes on each assessment are still pretty low because I'm trying to avoid students getting really anxious about, just having to do it perfect the first time. I will typically leave the last few weeks of a course as kind of like a buffer where no new assignments are coming in and students have time to just focus on revisions or on, if there's a presentation or a project, they'll have time to kind of focus on that. I tend to be pretty flexible on deadlines. I'm a slow grader by default. So my rule of thumb is if students submit something before I'm finished grading that assignment, I will just add it to the pile. And in practice, that usually gives them a pretty decent buffer for when they can turn stuff in late. So they appreciate that. That kind of eases off the worry a little bit. In general, especially for a lot of these classes that I teach are graduate courses. Students are, working full time. They have families to deal with. They've got a lot going on in their lives. So I'm generally really open to accommodations. I'll extend deadlines. A lot of my deadlines are kind of flexible by default. But if students need a couple of extra attempts and they have a good reason for it, I'm fine with that. So that's one of the things I really like about mastery grading in general, because eventual mastery means that there's usually some flexibility built in, right? There's ways for students to accommodate, hiccups in their lives. All right, Justin's up.
Mm-hmm. So for me, I tend to not do very much in the realm of reassessment within the same quiz. So the exception to that is a token. So my students can exchange a token and a video solution to a quiz, and that will replace a not yet or a pass with a pass plus. If students don't have access to video recording equipment or anything like that, they're welcome to come to my office, and they're going to get a couple questions, but those are usually to help them along. But otherwise, when a student completes a revision, that goes towards a separate category in my bundle, which is that the sum of % revised passed component. And that's because I found that for mastery, I really value that first attempt, except for the video solution where they're really going through it thoroughly. I appreciate that. And then there's a great question about learning targets that show up at the end of the course and having enough time to evaluate them and give multiple attempts on those things. Sometimes I use the final as part of that. So as I said before, I give my final as a points-based grade modifier. But every once in a while, so in a recent differential equations course, for instance, my eigenvalue unit, they clearly did not get it. The quiz revealed that quite clearly. And so I said, okay, we don't have time for another in-class quiz. So what I'm going to do is there's going to be a question similar to this on the final. And if you pass it, I'm going to grade that kind of two ways. One, points-based for the final, but also I'm going to look at that through my pass plus rubric idea and see if that should count for a quiz or not. But I wanted to talk, I do want to talk a bit more about tokens. Every student in my class starts with a token, and they can earn up to 3 additional tokens throughout the term. And there's lots of different ways that they can earn those tokens. So if there's a speaker on campus that I want to encourage my students to go see, I can say, look, go to this talk and you'll get a token for it. There are other things that I've found that I care increasingly about. So for instance, a thing I'm doing right now is trying to help students identify ways that they can practice self-care. And so I have a separate self-care assignment that when they complete that, they earn a token. And the thing I really like about that is that, typically I wouldn't like something non-content related to factor directly into a grade, but the token doesn't usually factor directly into the grade because it still requires them to do something content related to earn that credit, right? So they practice self-care, for instance, and then they record a video solution and show me that they know the math content. So I really like tokens for that. They can be used to fudge the learning community points a little bit, but almost all of my students use them to convert not yet to pass pluses. That's the most common thing. And then I also use them to change the thresholds a little bit. And so we want to wrap up this section with the, well, that didn't work. Alara, quickly, learning community points, that's things like attendance, kind of homework that's not graded on correctness, just stuff that I'm expecting you to bring to class so that you're ready to participate in class. So yeah, we've all done things that didn't work, and I'm going to pass it to Emily to talk about her first one.
Yeah, so I think when I first started out, someone mentioned being on a quarter system or term system. I was also on a quarter system, and I just tried to have way too many standards. So I feel like, this has been brought up. How do you know how many standards to have? And I think it can be a little bit tricky. What I found that's working for me now is I have, a lot of standards, I would say, but certain ones are core standards. And so those are the ones that my C student would definitely have to pass, but they may not have to pass any more than that. Those are the kind of, I wouldn't want you to leave this course without knowing blank standards. And then I have some supplementary standards. These are the other things that, my B and my A students would do. So I would caution about trying to do too much and having too many standards at the beginning of when you're trying this. Tom?
For my pitfalls, I started off initially by using like a 0, 1, 2 tier system. So the idea was that a 2 would mean mastered or perfect or had only tiny errors, and a 1 was supposed to mean mostly mastered but with some small errors. Like they conceptually got the main ideas, but still had some mechanics to work out. And a 0 meant that they need to reassess. But if I had a quiz that had like 2 problems on it, students thought that 0 meant they didn't get either right, 1 meant they got 1 right, and 2 meant they got both right. But that's not what I wanted to communicate. They needed to understand the concepts of both problems if they wanted to earn even the 1. That was kind of a constant battle. And so I quickly learned that you don't want to use anything that resembles a point-based system if you're trying to do mastery grading. At least anything we have like a sliding scale, that just it's too easy for students to think of it in terms of a traditional course. Various iterations of using different kinds of spreadsheets to track and communicate progress were kind of a source of frustration for me. And as I mentioned earlier, setting up pivot tables was kind of my solution. Everything before that was painful. Someday, I may take the dive into Canvas's mastery grading system. I know that there are good resources out there. I know that Sharon is a wizard, but so far my initial forays into it have, again, frustrated me. So I just keep doing what I'm doing. Go ahead, Chad.
My biggest pitfall, I think, has been overcomplicating things. My very first attempt at mastery grading, after I got convinced to try it out by Robert Talbert, I'm going to put the blame on him, was in an abstract algebra class, and I decided that I wanted to try and split all the problems into easy and medium and hard, and build the grading chart from there. And it was just a horrible nightmare because partly I didn't get the split right. And it was just a lot for students to track, and it was a big headache. And even then, even after I became, so-called better at this, some years later, I tried a calculus course where I wanted to include more flexibility by allowing students to apply, like, online homework points or lab points toward standard passes in a way that Tom does much more elegantly than I do. And the effect was that nobody, almost including me, could like actually figure out what a student's grade was because there were too many moving parts. So you want to make it part of getting over this hurdle of students buying in is make it so they can clearly understand what's going on. If you overcomplicate things, that's going to be a problem for you, and it's going to be a problem for them.
Yeah, I have definitely been in the overcomplicated camp. And so I echo pretty much everything that's been said there, especially, tracking student progress. I've fallen down on that many times. But the one thing I want to add, and the thing that's kind of driven me away from when I started mastery grading and I started with reassessments, I didn't have a lot of time to generate lots of new quizzes that looked really different from the previous quiz. And I kind of thought maybe that was unfair to some extent if a student's expecting to reassess a particular quiz. But what I found is that a conceptual question becomes procedural the second time through, right? They shortcut demonstrating the understanding and just say, okay, mechanically, I can answer this question because I know this bit goes here, that bit goes there, those kinds of things. So that's a place where I really struggled. But I wanted to mention one thing about student buy-in because it came up in the Q&A. A really good first assignment is like a first homework assignment is to give the students a mocked up grade book for a sample student and ask them, according to the syllabus, what grade would this student earn? Just to kind of orient them to like, okay, halfway through the course when lots of things are moving in the grade book, what does that mean? That has helped my students understand the setup tremendously. And Tom mentioned it before, but I wanted to echo it. Whenever you have these percents or you have these bundle systems, to some degree, you're making the best choice you can at the start of the semester as where those cutoffs are. But you shouldn't, I don't think you should feel too obligated to hold yourself strictly to them if it makes sense to, nudge them down a little bit because, oh, well, these targets didn't quite get as much time, or, there's lots of reasons why you might change those requirements slightly. And you should be thinking about that, I think, throughout.
Yeah, I want to
so,
second that. That's made a huge difference in my class. Like I've gone from so many students being like, where am I halfway during the semester, or like, even at the end, like I'm gonna get an A, right? Well, no, because you didn't do these other things, to almost none of that by just kind of having them look at a mock student.
So there's a links slide here at the end, and these slides are posted, I think, somewhere.
We will make all slides available. We'll be emailing out an after conference email with the details.
And there's a temporary link. There are links in the Q&A that have a copy of our slides shared currently.
All right. Thank you very much. Are there any other slides that you wanted me to display before we continue into the Q&A part here? All right. So thank you very much for everybody. There's a lot of great details there, and I appreciate the sort of subtleties you discussed, right? Why might you want to use some of these? When might you not want to? How have you made it flexible for yourself as well as for your students? So we are nearly done with this session. Presenters, are there any more questions you wanted to make sure to answer from Q&A or chat?
Reading back through the Q&A,
Yeah.
spacing out.
The extreme chat, yep. All right. As you're doing this, I want to make sure to advertise here that if you would like to see some more of these ideas, right? This whole presentation has been based on a paper from this Primus special issue on implementing mastery grading in the undergraduate mathematics classroom. But as you've noticed, inevitably, right, this paper would be very useful across many disciplines. But other papers in that special issue are also useful, even though they may be written about specific math classes. So the special issue includes papers that have the very careful details of many classes at many different levels. This says that all MAA members have free access, which is true. However, for the month of June, everybody has free access. And a list of all of the papers and a link directly to that free access special issue is available on our resources page with the link right here. So I encourage everybody to do that. Go grab all the papers, download them, and filter them out. And Build-a-syllabus is actually available for free in the resources list always. We've got a deal with Primus to make that freely available to all participants of the session. All right. With that, unless there are any final questions.
I had a final comment just on that point. Yeah, so our examples came from math, but there was a great question right in the beginning about what does this look like in biology. The place where I started for getting my objectives together was I just looked back at all of my past exams and said, what's this question really getting at? And I built my list of objectives from those. And then in terms of how broad and pacing them, then I looked at, well, when does this come up and how many quizzes can I fit in to my time frame? And just using those two things kind of helped me build my objectives and build my pacing for it. But then I think you'll find many of the mastery grading stuff and the paper helpful, because we're all mathematicians, yes, but I think all of these things extend far beyond it.
Absolutely. And I do want to mention there are channels for many different disciplines on Slack. And so if you want some specific questions about how to apply things to your discipline, that's a great place to go. Right now, we have a 1 hour lunch break. That's until 1 o'clock Eastern, because it's currently noon Eastern. And following that, you'll want to know where you need to go, because we have parallel sessions for half an hour. You can come to the poster session, read posters, and talk with the authors who are each going to be in their own separate breakout rooms for Q&A time. And there are also optionally discussions based on time zone. And so please carefully look at which of those you want to go to. Everyone is welcome at any of those. After all that's done in a half an hour, there will be group chats that we would like everybody to go to, and those are divided by your choice of novice or progressing. All right, with that, thank you all for being here. Have a great lunch, and we will see you in an hour.
Yeah.